I'm pleased to introduce tonight's speakers, Dr. Diane Cashin and Laura Salau. A little bit about Diane. So Diane is an RECE in Ontario. She has taught early childhood education at Seneca College at both the degree and diploma level. Diane's doctoral thesis was on emergent curriculum and published in 2009. Diane has co-written 2 textbooks, Playing and Learning in Early Childhood Education and Empowering Pedagogy. Her 3rd textbook is actually forthcoming this month and focuses on outdoor play and nature pedagogy. Co-authored with Beverly Dietz. And along with Beverly, Diane has been a lead researcher on a Lawson Foundation funded project on outdoor play, which has produced 12 online modules for early learning teachers. Diane has worked in a volunteer capacity for many years in the early learning community and is the past president of the Association for Early Childhood Educators of Ontario and the current chair of the York Region Nature Collaborative. Diane retired from Seneca College in 2014 and is teaching part-time at Ryerson University in Toronto. Diane believes in continuous professional learning and recently attended a study tour in Reggio Emilia in Italy. Diane writes a blog to support professional learning in early childhood education and loves to engage in continuous professional learning face-to-face and through social media platforms. Diane presents workshops and keynote addresses in Ontario, across Canada, and internationally. Laura Salau, an RECE with Seneca College at the ECE Lab School there, began her journey in the field of early learning over 25 years ago, initially as a student, and then joined the passionate teaching team at Seneca College Lab School. She's always been on a progressive educational path that places value on children, families, and the community. Laura has led many initiatives and contributes within the early learning sector, both locally and globally. She's had the opportunity to work collaboratively with many influential educators throughout the years, and which has in turn fostered and strengthened her pedagogical philosophy and continuous journey of learning. Laura has inspired students and educators and enriched their own journey of learning and has inspired qualitative change in the sector. She recently visited the schools of Reggio Emilia and is excited about the shared spirit and energy about the upcoming changes within the sector of early learning in Ontario. So now I'd like to pass it off to Diane, please, and thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay, hello everybody, and thank you to the college for inviting Laura and I to do this webinar. Pedagogical documentation is something we both feel very strongly about and passionate about. And Laura has been a student of mine many years ago, so we go way back. And I'm really thrilled that she is at the lab school and we continue to have a relationship. We were both in Reggio Emilia together, as you heard, because I love to see the work that she does, and especially the work that she has done on pedagogical documentation, and you will get to see that tonight as well. So we both recognize that pedagogical documentation is a very big and a very complex topic, but we'll try to do our best to touch upon the types of documentation, the analysis of documentation, the practice of documentation, and the benefits of pedagogical documentation tonight. So as mentioned already, the Standards 2 Curriculum and Pedagogy clearly indicate that early childhood educators, registered early childhood educators, are responsible for the practice of pedagogical documentation. And we both, Laura and I, believe that RECs are knowledgeable and competent and capable to do documentation, but because it's such a big and complex topic, we know that you may need some support. So we hope to offer that to you tonight in this webinar. So before we do, we have a fun little poll to do, and it's just your best answer to the following questions. So as you can see, almost all of the answers are correct, but it's just a way to show how complex this topic really is. And it is very much involves displaying photographs, but it is also involves the analysis and the interpretation of what you share with families, children, and other educators. So thank you for that. Now we'll get right into the background of pedagogical documentation. Where does it come from? Well, most of you probably know it does come from Reggio Emilia, and it is a term that has been applied to the practice of making learning visible, which is a research practice that the educators in Reggio Emilia do. And it is also about making children's learning visible, about making their thinking visible. It's a form of professional advocacy because it's an opportunity for you to show your stuff. It's a tool for family engagement. It's a form of assessment. It's a tool to support curriculum development. And it's a way of making your professionalism visible. So it has multiple complexities involved. So now I'm going to talk about the benefits to educators. So it is a way for you to reflect. It's a way to be a reflective practitioner because you get to review your documentation and you learn about learning. How do children learn? This gives you that opportunity to reflect continuously. And it is professional learning. So if you engage in pedagogical documentation, you can meet the requirements of the CPL. So next I'm going to talk about the benefits to children. And children really need to have documentation that's accessible to them. So having it in their environment, at their level, outdoors, indoors, having them be able to access their portfolios, it's really important because they will see themselves as active participants in the curriculum. And they can also use the documentation to recall and build on past experiences. And of course, it is a way to involve the family and involve the broader community, and children benefit from that. Now, speaking of families, documentation really helps to make what you do visible to parents and families. It's a way of transparency, it's a way of communication, and it's a way of support and education. So let's say, as I hope this is the case, that you're trying to embed more outdoor play in your programs. And so you share documentation with the families to show how much learning and children can have when they're outdoors and playing. So you may also then ask parents and remind parents to dress their children appropriately for the weather. So this is very important for families as a tool for communication, support, and education. So let's get into this difficult and complex process of pedagogical documentation. So it does involve listening and observing to begin with. So you're watching children. Let's say you're watching children in the block center. You're recording what they say, you're documenting what they're doing, you're taking pictures, you're whatever means that you can, you're collecting data about what is going on. And then you would share with the families, you would share with the children, and you would invite interpretation. You want to hear the perspective of others. If you don't have this last element in your documentation process, the sharing and inviting the interpretation of others, there is no opportunity for your documentation to move beyond mere documentation to pedagogical documentation, which is a way of using your documentation to lead your curriculum. So here is a very handy framework for analysis. So when you invite the interpretation of others, children, families, other educators, you then ask them what they see, because it's not only your perspective, it's what other people see, because that will help you really understand what is going on. So the first thing you look for is the objective, the what do you see, what description can you write about what you see. So let's go back to the block center, and you've got a couple of children playing together in the block center, and they're creating a block structure. So that's what you see. But what does it mean? So what? What's meaningful about what you see? This is the interpretive question. And so you look closely at the photos that you have, and that you see the children are creating patterns with symmetry. So then you can say the children are at the pattern symmetry stage of block development. You also look closely and see that there is some collaboration. So you can then say the children are at the cooperative stage of play. So you have interpreted. But now, where's that going? If you just print the pictures off and write a few things down and post it on the wall, it's just documentation. But if you look at it and say, so now what? This is your decision question. This is where you decide how this will lead my curriculum, how this will lead my pedagogical approach to what is happening in my classroom. So you're looking at these block pictures and you say, I'm going to continue to support children's engagement and experience with patterning and symmetry. So how can you do that? Well, it doesn't have to stay in the blocks. You can go outside and create nature mandalas using natural loose parts. You can do it in your math area. You can do it in art indoors. So there's a way of continually building on this children's expressed interest in patterning. So this is a decision question. This is what you wonder about, where you can take what you see in your documentation. This makes your documentation pedagogical. So the next thing I'm going to talk about are the types, because there are many different types of documentation, but not all of it is pedagogical. So you can collect just reams and reams of observation notes. You can write everything a child says throughout the day, and you can take photo after photo after photo. That's all raw data. It's all wonderful stuff, but unless it's shared and analyzed, it is not pedagogical. So to be pedagogical, it requires the interpretation from others, it requires your analysis, and it requires you to lead your curriculum path based on the knowledge you have gained from this documentation. So let's talk again about this wonderful experience in the block center. So you could have a documentation book, and this could just be like a sketchbook, a blank book. It could be something that is a living document, and parents, other teachers, the children can be invited to record what they see. Children could draw pictures of their block structures and put it in the block, the documentation block book. And so you could have one in the block center, you can have one in the math center, the art center, and it's a collaborative book. And this is a real important way to have children's voices in your documentation. But let's say you take a day off and you're not in the block center for a day. So somebody else may continue that documentation about the symmetry and the patterning that the children are doing with their block structures. Learning stories are wonderful. They do come from New Zealand, but are now worldwide, and they are usually short stories written to children. So you might say to a child that was involved in this block play that I see that you spent a lot of time creating patterns in blocks and that you worked with other children. And so you're building on the child's dispositions and their child's confidence. And that really is a feature of all documentation. It should be about the competence and the capacity of children, not their weaknesses. You're not looking to focus on that. You're looking to focus on their strengths. So learning stories should be shared with parents. Parents can give some input and say, oh, they're doing that at home as well, or I'm going to give them some of these opportunities at home. And parents love to read positive stories about their children. And so learning stories are a great little narrative, a little story about a play episode, about 1 or 2 or 3 children usually, that can be shared with families and children. So learning stories can also be put together in a portfolio. And inside that portfolio, you could also have written observations. You could have samples of children's their work. So it could be their representations of their block creations. It could be drawings. It could be many different things that get included in this portfolio. And as you can see in the picture on the slide, these portfolios were put on a shelf and children could access them all the time, and they could read the stories of their own learning. And so this is very important to have children's voices in there. And again, portfolios need to illustrate children's abilities and not their deficit, but their abilities and their strengths. Okay, this is the last one that I'm going to talk about before I give the stage over to Laura. And these are what we most often see, documentation panels or documentation boards. And it's really important that you think about where you're going to post these. Now, you could create these on your computer digitally and print them off and then put them on a board. And the board should be accessible. It should be not hidden in a corner in a dark space in the room, but where parents can see it and where children can see it. And you should be inviting interpretation. So you could have a little notebook for somebody to add, or a post-it note for somebody to add their ideas, because again, that interpretation is so important. Try to make them interactive, even where you've got a little flip or a little open, something to open, so that people will want to look at them. And you've got to think about visual literacy here as well, because if there's a lot of clutter, there's too much information, there's too many pictures, too much writing, then people aren't going to want to stop and look at that. So I am going to now turn this over to Laura, who has done such an amazing job of creating documentation that is aesthetically pleasing, but at the same time has so much depth of meaning. And so I'm really honored to share the stage now with Laura.
Thank you very much, Diane. I just want to share with everyone the journey from documenting an experience to pedagogical documentation. This is a project that we've worked on as in the lab school for the past 3 years. Many layers to pedagogical documentation as told through the layers of paint. Olivia is a toddler at Seneca College Lab School. She led educators on an incredible year-long reflective journey, documenting her initial investigations with paint, led to a huge pedagogical transformation and shift in thinking for us all.
Hi, Laura. Before you continue,
Educators,
can you
hi.
start your webcam if you can? That would be great so we can see you.
Sorry about that. Hi, everyone.
Great, we can see you now. That's wonderful. Thank you.
No problem. Thank you, everyone. Sorry about that. Educators began to capture moments of engagement with paint with Olivia. Multiple episodes were documented by individual educators and analyzed. Some subjective reflection of development. We began to wonder if this soulful expression through the layers of paint and language of paint portrayed stories, thoughts, and thinking processes for Olivia. These are just two examples of individual educators' documentation styles. Educators began to share their reflections with each other, the children and Olivia's family. We gained valuable insight through others' thinking and viewpoints, which propelled us to think even deeper about the philosophy of Loritz Malaguzzi and the schools of Reggio Emilia. Paint was Olivia's tool of expression. We could see the passion, soul, and spirit resonate through each stroke. This was Olivia's 100. The collaboration unfolded and transcended to the rest of the children, researching and capturing each child's 100. A new perspective of thinking for educators. Each child viewed as an individual with unique gifts, talents, and expressions of their inner self. We have observed and documented children in deeper ways, trying to understand them and how they come to know and understand the world, trying to interpret the spirit of the child. A paint room seemed to resonate with everyone, a place to express and be free. A quote by Loritz Malaguzzi, "The space is an aquarium that mirrors the ideas and values of the people that live in it." With each stroke of paint exchange between space, child, and teacher, a new layer is added. These layers become very symbolic, metaphors for teaching and learning. These layers of paint representing beliefs and values, each stroke of paint a symbol representing a philosophy of teaching that encompasses relationships, connections, belonging, permission, trust, freedom, joy, and wonder. The space, a symbol conveying our held beliefs. The layers of paint, the deepening of relationships and reflection of the experiences began to cultivate a community. Educators explore, create, and are overwhelmed by what has transpired in this space. The connections, relationships, and the overwhelming response by children, colleagues, families, and community to creative expression and joy. Through pedagogical documentation, the room has in many ways revealed itself as a room held in philosophical beliefs and values, a space where children's voices are respected and listened to, a space that speaks, "We are here and we are listening," a space that speaks to the 100 languages of children, a space that honors the image of the creative child. Documentation plays a vital role in supporting curriculum, demonstrating the principles of how does learning happen. It provides a more focused lens into researching children's development and thinking, and a more in-depth insight into the next steps. Documentation, a lure in initiating and sharing of dialogue, and an invitation to grow as a community together. I'm just going to hand it back over to Diane.
Thank you, Laura. That was amazing. I'm looking forward to visiting and seeing the many layers of paint again, because I know this is something that you started a while back and now have brought it back to life.
For sure.
It really has been a wonderful opportunity for us to share with you all about our passion for documentation, and hope that you realize through Laura's words and the little bit of information that I could give you tonight that this is a complex process, and it is going to be different depending on everybody's context. So it's not, nobody's going to duplicate exactly what Laura has done, but you can be inspired, just like Laura and I were inspired from viewing the documentation in Reggio Emilia about a month ago. We'll just kind of bring this to conclusion, and we will have time for some questions. So in conclusion, pedagogical documentation makes children's learning visible, but it also makes visible the professionalism of the registered early childhood educator that has put together that documentation. So it is important that you spell things correctly, and that it looks aesthetically pleasing, and it is put together in a professional manner, because it is saying something about not only the children and their learning, but it is saying something about the educator that has put it together. So sometimes you might need some help. I sometimes didn't print as well as my colleagues when I was working in childcare, so I would have them print for me. So it should be a collaborative effort. It should be something that people support each other with. So sharing documentation is evidence of your professionalism. And if we all did such a wonderful job doing this, like Laura has, it will elevate our profession. It will make us all look really, really good. So please keep up the work, and I hope that your confidence will increase every time that you document, every time that you try something different. And there isn't really, I know that people sometimes fear being wrong, and I know my students who have done documentation will often ask, is this right, Diane? Is this right? And I always say it can't be wrong, because it is something that you've created, and you can only learn from it. Laura, did you want to add something to that?
I think the most important thing is to document and share. Not only share what's written and a photograph, but have a conversation. It's your passion that's going to come out in your conversation, as well as the documentation, and share it with everyone. People can't read between the lines, only the story can.
Absolutely. So practicing documentation is a way to show that you are continuously learning, because documentation is that opportunity you have to learn more about children and how they learn, and learn more about how other people see the children. And sometimes you may not see something that somebody else does. You might see the obvious and you say, oh, I see that the children are interested in something. And someone might see something that isn't so obvious, that that it's not the actual topic, but it's the opportunity to feel powerful or to feel confident. So it is something that we should all try to do, and try to analyze, share, and consider where we are going with this in our programming. Now, I've had an opportunity to read a couple of the questions. I found one in there that's really interesting, because I get it all the time, and that's about apps. You can use many things to create documentation. I know Laura has used PowerPoint sometimes, and so PowerPoint is a software that we all have access to. You can use certain apps that are available to purchase. There are a couple. Hi Mama is one. Story Park is another, and those are two common ones that are used in our province. It really doesn't matter what you use. You don't have to purchase something as long as you find a way to, like Laura says, share your documentation. And I'm wondering if there's any other questions. Oh, I see someone has put down Twitter, as a lover of Twitter and Facebook. I do love to see the sharing of documentation on social media platforms. You do always have to consider ethics and make sure that you always have consents. But even when you have consents from a family one day, situations can change, and the next day something happens and they no longer want their child's face to be posted. You can't take that back. You know that about social media. So it really is, if you are going to share on Twitter and Instagram and Facebook, it's great to share without faces. But again, it's not, and I noticed this earlier, someone had said about Instagram. So posting a picture on Instagram is not pedagogical unless you share in your comments. You share your interpretation, you share what you're seeing, and that you're open to other people commenting back. And sometimes that takes some a letting go of because we do get defensive, and oh, how could you say that? I never saw that, and how can I think this way and you're saying something else. But that's important to let that go, because you need to take that as something to help you move forward.
And I think that's vulnerability. You set yourself up for some vulnerability, and I think it's okay. That's how we all learn, to be vulnerable and open to others' suggestions and comments, and that's the journey of learning.
Absolutely.
I agree, Diane.
Yeah, and so I don't know if I can see any other questions there. Let me just take a quick peek.
Yeah, hi Diane, this is Melinda. I can certainly jump in and share some of the questions that we've seen through the chat box. There was actually a question early on in your presentation around the benefits to families around transparency. So someone wanted to know, could you share maybe some more experiences about really making transparency work and making it go a little bit more smoothly, or how that would look? Any thoughts from Laura, yourself, or Diane?
Well, I think Laura is probably the best one to speak to that, because again, she does it in practice and I only write about it, so I do it in theory. So Laura, go ahead.
Transparency is very important. It's that communication with families. It's involving the families authentically, on an authentic level, and getting to know, building a relationship with the families. And pedagogical documentation does help with this. And through the layers of paint, I'll give you an example. A lot of the families were from Brazil, and a student from Brazil was involved in the project and shared her experiences with a child, with the family. And we set aside a laptop and had them come in for an evening, and they shared their experiences with the families, but in Portuguese. And she was able to translate that for everybody. But it was such a pinnacle moment, and it truly, truly deepened our relationship with that family, all of our relationship, even though we didn't understand it at that moment. So to be authentic with the families.
Absolutely. Is there any other questions, Melinda?
Just a few more. We have one, just a thought. Do you feel sometimes that documentation is actually shared in a limited way, where maybe it's really just used to support the report cards? Do you feel that's something you...
Well, you'd be referring to to kindergarten, to FDK there, because I would hope that report cards are not being used in childcare centers. And it shouldn't only be for those purposes, but documentation absolutely is a form of assessment. And so you really don't have to do any kind of checklists when you're doing documentation, because the analysis of the documentation tells you a lot about children. But it's really important, and even for the report cards that are being used in kindergarten, that there is this emphasis on children's strengths and not on their weaknesses. This is what the direction of How Does Learning Happen and the kindergarten program 2016, and so when you're using it to show the capacity of children, it really, going back to the question before, it really is so wonderful for parents to truly understand their children, and like Loris Malaguzzi says, nothing without joy, and a parent should see that that joyful learning that the child is engaged in, and be happy to receive documentation, and not concerned that it's going to expose that their child can't use scissors, or doesn't play nicely. It really is about that capacity that we should be focusing on.
Okay, that's great. Thank you, Diane. There are a number of questions really relating to those who are working in school boards, along with a teacher and working in collaboration. So there are some questions about really how to use pedagogical documentation in that program, or perhaps even when you are a supply educator and you're in and out of programs. Do you have any advice for those RECEs in those environments?
Well, my advice is that as a supply, or with your specific role as an or a DECE, that documentation is something that you should be engaging in, and whether it is something that you use just for your own purposes. So even as a supply, you should be trying to understand the children that you are working with. So documentation provides that opportunity. You're collecting data when you are with the children. So you are taking notes, and you are writing down things children are saying, and you are taking photographs, and you can not worry so much about children's confidentiality when you're taking photographs of what they're drawing, or taking photographs of their creations in the block center. There's many ways to document without having children pose for you, and having their faces visible. So it is just wonderful that we have the capacity of the technology that we do these days. It certainly has made documentation a lot easier.
Okay, great. Thank you, Diane. Just a question around leadership and pedagogical documentation for pedagogical leaders, those who are looking to improve their centers or even attend some workshops or seminars to really work with the staff in their centers or in their environments. Any thoughts on resources?
Well, I know that there's been some significant funding put towards centers of excellence, so that will focus on building capacity with pedagogical leaders. So I know that there's things coming down that will support this. But right now, anybody can be a pedagogical leader. You don't need to be assigned that role. You take that role on yourself. So, as a pedagogical leader, you are building capacity in others. You are elevating others. You're lifting others up. So, how do you do that? Well, you support them in their documentation attempts. You help them. You offer them interpretation. You work with them, and that's how we create pedagogical leaders, because pedagogical leaders are there to support others. So it is again, the same thing with children. You're focusing on the strengths of others. You're focusing on their capacity. You're believing that your image of the educator is that they are competent and they are capable. So if you really, as pedagogical leaders, if you take that to heart, you will affect change, because people will want to be with you and hear from you. Laura, how do you do it in practice? Because you are definitely a pedagogical leader at the lab school.
Well, again, it comes back to sharing. It's sharing episodes that you've observed. Within those episodes, the interpretations that you make, the development that you see, and it's sharing with other educators and with families. And this enriches the documentation. It brings in new ideas, new thoughts, provokes questions, and that's what a leader's all about. It's not just the amount you put up on the walls or what you put up in the walls. It's the connections that you make, the relationships that this documentation creates.
That's for sure. So are there any other questions? Now I see that there are a lot of questions about reporting, and which is outside the realm of expertise of both Laura and myself, as we are both RECs, and my background is working in childcare, as Laura is working at the lab school. So I do know that the individual boards offer professional learning around and the report cards, and there is some resources to help with that. And let's see. So
Yeah, I think.
Go ahead.
Go ahead, Diane.
I just saw a comment about extending the learning, and I think that's something we could definitely speak to, is which is what makes documentation pedagogical. So that decisions, that decisive question that you have an answer about where you are going next with your curriculum. That is so important. And sometimes you have to kind of stop and spend some time with your documentation. It doesn't mean it'll take a day or 2 days. It might take a week. And Laura, tell them about the layers of paint, because you definitely took some time off and came back to it. And how did that time help you extend the learning?
For sure, Diane. I think there becomes, once you start getting into a big documentation piece and sharing it, and it's becoming pedagogical. There's many threads I find that takes you on different routes, all eventually weaving back together to, I guess, the same journey that you started with, and leading you there, but from different perspectives. So for example, the layers of paint, we looked at children. It wasn't just about the paint and Olivia with the paint, but it was about looking deeper into the spirit and soul of a child, putting aside the development for a bit, and looking at who these children are. And that led us onto such different path and journey and perspective that we started seeing everything in a whole new light. But eventually it all led us back to this journey and this paint through the paint room. But again, we went off onto many different tangents and threads, and we only did that through sharing. And it led us down many paths. But still to this day, the paint room is still there, and we're still playing around with new educators, new children, new perspectives.
Yes, and it's certainly something, again, that I've seen and I'm looking forward to seeing. I'm so excited to respond to a certain question that talks about this extension of learning, and it says, aren't you turning it into a theme? And as somebody who wrote a doctoral dissertation about moving away from the thematic way to emergent curriculum, I really am glad to have this opportunity to respond to that. Now, nothing in what Laura has described relates to a theme, as far as I'm concerned, because usually themes are canned. We all know what theme we're talking about in many centers. It's probably has to do with the weather, and it probably has to, we've just finished one holiday and what's coming up next, and so when you're talking about the layers of paint and children's journeys to represent and explore, which is what is coming out in this documentation, in no way is that theme related, but it is something that can continually be looked at and interpreted to say, okay, what can I do next to build on these things that the children are experiencing? So it is not theme related, but certainly you can do documentation related to themes. But I would hope that you look for the deeper meaning by asking yourself that "so what" question, because there's more here than if the children are playing with zoo animals than an interest in zoos. Because if you look closely, there's the way the children are playing together, the way the children are expressing themselves, and this is what we can build or extend the learning on, not the actual concrete topic, because yes, that would be something that would be very themey. I'm also noticing questions about outdoor play, and one of the things that I've been doing some research lately on is bringing documentation outdoors, and that really helps children to build on their experiences outdoors, and is something that is really new, and not many people are doing it. So here's your chance to be a pioneer. Laura, have you tried to bring some documentation outdoors?
For sure we have. And we've attached multiple episodes of play and episodes to our fences, to our trees, to our furniture outside. We've brought in books so the children can reflect and engage and share with each other, and continue that exploration at a deeper, more meaningful level. It's been wonderful. It's been a great
And
journey.
sometimes you can bring it out temporarily, or you can use something to make sure that it's weatherproof. But again, you know, we need to go beyond thinking documentation is just one place. It's just on a bulletin board, and that there's many different ways of doing it. Now I'm seeing a question about bringing it back to inquiry. What do the children want to learn more about? They are the leaders. Donna, I don't know if that was a question or a comment, but that certainly is amazing. You know, we do hear a lot about inquiry from kindergarten programs. And inquiry is emergent curriculum, and early childhood educators have been saying emergent curriculum for a long time. So let's be proud that we've been doing inquiry for many, many years. And again, inquiry is about helping children to look closely, to notice, to think. So I love the visible thinking routine of I see, I think, I wonder, and there is a relationship to what, so what, now what, which is the framework for analysis that I shared. So when you're looking at documentation, when you're sharing documentation with children, what do you see? That's the objective description. What do you think? That is the interpretation. And what do you wonder? Where is it going next? So that's something that's very much applied to inquiry.